Hello class, and welcome to the module on voting, campaigns, and elections. In this video, we're going to go through the logic of voting, we're going to talk about the history of the right to vote, and then we're going to dive into some empirical analyses surrounding who's using the right to vote and political participation more broadly. So grab a beverage and let's get started. Okay, so American democracy is not exactly a democracy in the purest sense of the word. It, in fact, is a republic, and this is Madison's term. And it's a republic and not a direct democracy because we as voters elect and delegate our authority, our representational authority, to a smaller group of citizens that stay in office and make these governing decisions. And this is Hank, he's down there. And this is necessary because you can imagine if direct democracy was holding for all government decisions, where the populace and the population and citizens were consulted on every single governing decision. The transaction cost would be through the roof. Nothing would ever get done. It's just not feasible. And so instead, American democracy is in fact a republic where these elected officials are delegated to make the decisions on behalf of public interests. Now, of course, what ensues here is the classic principal agent problem, right? Because the voters are the principals and they're effectively, hiring agents or elected officials, representatives to make decisions on their behalf. But once elected, those agents may follow the principal's interest, the voter's interest, but they also might follow their own. And this divergence of interest leads to moments in time where the principal agent problem becomes a problem, where elected officials are doing what's in their best interest and not in the best interest of the constituency. So how do we address this? Well, one way to do it, and it's not a perfect solution, but it is a good solution, it's the best solution we can come up with, is through holding frequent and fair and free elections. And so what elections do is introduce into this principal agent problem accountability, right? Wherein the agent has to go back to the principals. The representative needs to go back to the voters and say, here's what I've done. Can I keep my job, right? And the voters get to decide yay or nay and vote, right? So these are the kind of dynamics and the logic behind why we have elections and why it's important for the voters or the principals to be engaging in them to hold our representatives accountable, to enact our preferences in governing. But then the question becomes, where did this right to vote come from? Who does it extend to, and when did that extension arise and how? And then in turn, who's using the right to vote? So that's where we're going to get into some slides.
Okay, voting, campaigns, and elections. This slideshow and this video are dedicated to the right to vote and the people who use that right. All right, now the right to vote. Well, the practice of limiting suffrage arrived, this was a common thing in American history, and it arrived in North America with the first settlers from England. It was inherited in that respect. And every colony imposed a property qualification for voting. So every colony had its own laws with respect to this, and all of them had property qualifications. And many denied the right to vote to Catholics, to Jews, to Native Americans, and to any freed black slaves. Women were also very rarely allowed to vote, and many of these restrictions survived the Revolution intact. And subsequently, every expansion of suffrage since has then had to overcome both philosophical objections and resistance rooted in mundane calculations of, guess what? Political advantage. All right, now, this thinking about like the wider suffrage for men here in the United States versus abroad, basically this is a function of the fact that the land was easier to acquire and thus far more evenly distributed in the colonies than in England. So a larger proportion of adult men ended up being qualified to vote. Now, originally the argument was that only the independent and virtuous were fit to govern and thus vote. And so universal suffrage was actually not even fully achieved until the 1940s. And this is in the wake of the triumph of the Jacksonian democracy, right? And we talked about this era in partisan politics, right? And the argument then that only the virtuous were fit to govern began to lose its ground. This is a moment where much more kind of democratic values and every man should vote and participate were on the rise. And then eventually, and with obvious, reasoning, opposition to universal male suffrage became a political liability because these men were voting. All right, and let's talk about women's suffrage, and that is, of course, white women. The suffrage for women, the women's suffrage movement, grew directly out of the anti-slavery movement in that it shared many of its underlying ideals and, in fact, some of its activists. These activists included Catherine Beecher, Angelina Grimke, Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, and William Lloyd Garrison. And within this anti-slavery movement, many of these women saw opportunities and excelled in leadership, in writing, in speaking, and this paved the way for them to, understand how to organize a women's suffrage movement. Now, despite that organization, there was a great deal of resistance to women's suffrage. It was considered quite ridiculous. That women should vote was, widely considered quite absurd. And eventually, however, how did women get the right to vote? Well, they did so through political advantage once again. The women's suffrage movement was pretty strongly tied to the prohibition movement. Women were in strong support of prohibition, in part as a function of the fact that many women suffered through domestic violence, which was influenced quite significantly by substance abuse. And so women all across the country, especially in the West, were quite mobilized around prohibition, and those that were mobilized in support of prohibition saw that there's a political opportunity to giving women the vote. So prohibition was enacted into law in 1920, and shortly thereafter, women's vote was incorporated into American law with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, also in 1920. Now, suffrage for African Americans, the effective and protected right to vote for African Americans and Black Americans came substantially later than for all the rest of Americans. In fact, it came with the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And this was a function of systemic and institutionalized racism. And now it's systemic and it's institutionalized because it was in law. And we mean racism not as it's defined with respect to open and aggressive hatred and violence against Black Americans, which was obviously present, but we mean it actually, in fact, in terms of the the idea that Black Americans experience life on all levels in the American society differently, and this is with respect to employment, with respect to pay, with respect to resources, education, services provided from the government, any kind of quality of life, and finally the right to vote. Many, for instance, of my Black friends, their parents did not have the right to vote effectively, when they turned 21, despite the fact that they were American citizens. But with the civil rights movement and the political incentives that were produced by the civil rights movement and the party realignments, ultimately the Voting Rights Act passed quickly, and this effectively achieved the goal of providing suffrage to African Americans in a protective and effective way. Now, with all of that history under our belts, we're now thinking about the question, who's actually using the right to vote today? Now, on the one hand, most Americans would agree that the right to vote is at the very heart of democracy in America, right? That's why people have fought so hard to acquire it. But on the other hand, most Americans don't vote. Right? So what gives? Well, let's look at voter participation, right? Because this seems almost hard to believe. Why aren't people voting? There has been this whole trend is arguably beginning with the sharp decline in voter turnout between 1960 and 1972. On average, only 58% of the eligible electorate is even registered to vote. Now, one explanation about this sharp decline has to do with the idea that party identification declined during this period as well. However, we also see, what about the historic 2016 presidential race? Only 60% turnout rate, right? That's not even that high. And then with the midterm elections in 2018, we did have historic highs, right, for midterms, which are low information elections as compared to presidential elections. And that was at 50%. Which isn't even that high still. And this is compared to the 2014 levels for the midterms, and that was at 37% turnout.
Okay, so even with the historic highs in voter turnout in the 2018 midterm elections, we still have a relatively low or unexpectedly low level of voter participation in the United States. Now, why might voter participation be low? Well, the fact of the matter is voting is irrational. Now, we have to go back to collective action problems to understand this, right? And we're thinking of voters, as rational beings. Now, this could be a stretch by some, conceptualizations of rational. But what we're modeling this, idea on is that voters and individuals are thinking about the costs of an action and the benefits of an action, and then deciding whether or not it's worth taking that action, right? And the fact is that the benefits associated with voting aren't dependent on my actually voting. I get to enjoy the benefits of governance in American democracy, and the services provided by American government, whether or not I vote. There's no, necessity of voting or I can't, engage or, receive Medicaid or Medicare, or I can't, enjoy public education. Voting isn't a necessity or requirement to get the services of government. And so it's a commons problem, right? Anyone can get the benefits of voting without actually having to vote. What's more, voting is actually quite costly. It doesn't just take, time away on a Tuesday from your day, right? You have to get there, you have to wait in line, you might, risk contraction of a deadly potential virus. But in addition, sometimes, people who are trying to take voting seriously do a lot of research about it. Who are the candidates? What do they stand for? Why do I want to vote for this person as opposed to this other individual? Voting is costly. And so when it comes to the cost-benefit analysis, right, where I can enjoy the benefits whether or not I vote, and the costs are actually quite high, it's a wonder anybody votes at all. So then that's the question, right? Who is voting and why? What are the factors that are predicting increased political participation in voting versus others? And how do these different factors break out across different groups? Well, let's take a closer look.
Well, the book covers some individual predictors, right? These are some of the factors that are affecting voter turnout and that have been measured at the individual level by past scholars. Now, we have seen across a number of different, broadly speaking, across much of the research that age and education levels are the strongest predictors across all of these major studies. Also, partisanship and partisan identification matters. Race and region, specifically if you live in a southern state, this has also been, observed as an influence on the likelihood that you will show up to vote. And then there's also social pressures and visibility that affect voter turnout. And that's Gerber, Green, and Larimer 2008. Now, those are maybe a little bit more institutional, and we'll review them in a minute. But one of the biggest factors, and we've talked about this in class before, relates to political engagement. And this is measured by scholars as political interest, efficacy, the degree to which you have political information, and also, once again, party identification. Now, what kind of person is politically engaged? And then in turn, because if political engagement influences voter turnout, who is politically engaged becomes the next important question. And let's take a closer look at that. So this is in the work. It's a book called Voice and Equality, Civic Volunteerism in American Politics. And it's written by Sidney Verba, Kay Lehman-Schlossman, and Henry Brady. And this is a seminal work. And in one of their studies, they have many, but this is table 12.4, so it's in chapter 12. And it's talking about, it's showing us some descriptive statistics about the political engagement divided by different levels of education, family income, race, ethnicity, and gender. And so what we see here is there are a number of different interesting things. We find, for instance, that as education levels increase over here on the left, right, we have, at the lowest level, we have grammar school or less, and then it increases a little bit step by step. We see a big increase in all the areas except for party strength. We see that political interest increases substantially once people go to college. We see a huge increase in political efficacy. And political efficacy relates to kind of my confidence, my ability to participate in voting and participate in politics. And then my interest in political information increases a great deal at this stage as well. We also see that income seems to matter with respect to efficacy and political interest. As income increases, so too does political interest, and so too seemingly does political efficacy, at a little bit less so with respect to, actually just as much, with political information. Once again, however, we see a consistent trend here that education doesn't matter, nor does family income matter, at least descriptively with respect to party identification. Now, interestingly, with respect to race or ethnicity, African Americans and Anglo-white Americans seem to be at the same level of political interest. However, Latinx communities, and this was written a little bit, but in the 90s, Latinx communities less so with regards to political interest. Anglo-white, this is not unexpected that white Americans feel a little bit more efficacious when it comes to politics, more so than quote-unquote minority Americans. And then with respect to political information, there is this discrepancy as well, and that's not unexpected given historic marginalization of these populations. But then men and women, we see very little difference. Now, with that in hand, let's take a closer look at actual participation, or rather predicted participation. So in this table, the authors are showing us an OLS regression, and that is a statistical analysis that is predicting the influence of these independent variables over here. And these are the different X's, and they're predicting the independent influence of these characteristics on overall participation. Now, what the authors are also doing is splitting the sample up by subgroup, right? These are the columns up here: men, women, blacks, Latinos, and those at the lowest socioeconomic status, deemed here poor. And what these are doing is essentially it's estimating the influence of these characteristics once again on the participation rates and the voting and the other political participation of men, of women, etc., independently of each other. So, what do we see? Well, as the textbook indicates, we see that here education has a strong and statistically significant influence on overall participation. And this is across men, women, blacks, and poor, and especially amongst those in the lowest socioeconomic status, right? We see that as 0.26. This is substantively quite high, and it's positive. This means that with every increase in the level of education, we see an increase in overall political participation by that percentage, which is strong. We see these stars next to it saying that this is statistically significant. In other words, we can be sure and confident that it's not just random, and it is in fact statistically different from zero. So those are substantial effects. We also see, though, down here with these participatory factors, these factors are the ones that we're thinking about with respect to political engagement. So you see that political interest, right, this across all groups is substantially high. It's above 0.20 for every of the groups except for those in this lowest socioeconomic class. Political information matters as well at statistically significant levels. Civic skills, right? This is civic engagement. This matters a great deal, as does income, right? Now, when we're looking at the individual characteristics up here, this also shows some interesting results. For instance, we see that women of, Black women, for them, this is a group that is substantially and significantly greater at their political participation than other groups, right? That's that 0.05, which is not as big, for instance, as 0.26 or 0.11. But sorry, that's my husband in the background. But it is statistically significant, and it means that Black women are voting and politically and participating in politics more so than other subgroups. What's more, we see over here in contrast with women who are Latina. They are this is a negative coefficient. This means that they are less likely at a pretty substantial rate to participate politically, right? So this is this variation across groups and demographics. And this is a table predicting empirical analysis. This is regression. And you're probably going to see this a lot when you're doing your annotated bibliographies and looking through scholarly research on politics, and especially on campaigns and votings. These kinds of analyses are common. So if you feel like you're freaking out and can't figure out what you're looking at, refer back to this video and see if you can see some, overlaps.
So in addition to the individual factors that can shape voter turnout and political participation more broadly, there are also broader institutional factors that can shape who shows up at the polls as well. And many of these have to do with the kind of intrinsic and psychological benefits that we can, create in the society as a whole in order to increase the benefit of voting that can outweigh that cost, right? Because we're still thinking about this rational actor and this collective action problem. How can we make the benefit of voting meaningful in a way that outweighs the costs? However, some institutional factors are actually creating barriers to voting, and this is a much less rosy picture. For instance, in the Jim Crow era, because it's states that enact laws and regulations associated with elections, many southern states imposed polling taxes or created literacy tests in order to be eligible to vote. And this was intended to suppress African American voters and Black voters. Those Black voters or African Americans that were able to, jump over these hurdles, have the sum to pay the tax, and were able to read, were often beaten, if not outright lynched, in order to send a message to their, fellow Black community members that they did not deserve the right to participate in American democracy in this fashion. The Voting Rights Act in 1965 outlawed polling taxes, as well as literacy tests and these kinds of different laws. And obviously those other actions were illegal to begin with. So that was an important step in the right direction. However, currently many states all over the United States have voter ID laws, which many studies show disproportionately impact certain groups more so than others. For instance, these voter ID laws require that people show up at the polls on election day with a driver's license or a passport in order to be able to vote. And many low-income individuals, Black and African Americans and Hispanic Americans, often don't have those forms of ID and thus can't vote. Studies are pretty conclusive with this respect. At the end of the day, what the reading kind of highlights with this in mind is that often it is, wealthy white Americans that are disproportionately overrepresented in our governing offices. However, the story is also rosy on the other side as well when we think about the social circumstances that influence voter turnout, right? And this has to do with, again, this psychological reward and how voting is seen as, civic duty is seen as rewarded in society. You might notice on election day that folks have those I voted stickers. There's a reason for that. It's in order to help people proclaim that they have participated and give them a reward. And studies show that those stickers increase voter turnout substantially. I personally collect all of mine and always have. Because I'm a nerd, but that's okay. You can be too. Start collecting your stickers. In turn, Gerber, Green, and Larimer in 2008 did a field study where they, they had one control group that was just going out to vote, but then they had an experimental treatment group wherein they told these voters that if they did vote, their neighbors would be informed about this. And as it turns out, their voting turnout almost doubled, right? So sort of the social dynamics about this, right? This is an institutional factor. We like to see our fellow Americans participating. It's inspirational. Now, obviously, not all of the story is as rosy, and we've seen this, right? The demographic differences matter in terms of voter turnout. So as you continue to do your research on your individual elections, maybe taking a close look at the demographics in your district or in your state, even in your small locality if your election is at that level. Thinking about, the different intersections between different groups, right? And education attainment, etc. Political interest is obviously hard to measure, but thinking about those kinds of, different factors might be important in playing a role in your individual election analyses. But that's it. This was a long video, and I'm grateful that you got all the way through. So keep up the good work and keep going with the module. Can't wait to see you on Monday.